Let's pick up where we left off in this greatest of stories, following Jesus through his final days in Jerusalem, learning alongside the disciples that his blood must be poured out for many, and that the good news of his resurrection must be proclaimed to the whole world. Join us as we journey with Jesus to the cross and beyond the Gospel of Mark.
The supreme law of the United States of America is the Constitution. And to this Constitution have been added 27 amendments, 25 of which are currently active. The first 10 amendments are called the Bill of Rights, which guarantee personal and individual rights. And all 10 of these were ratified in December of 1791. Now, the Fifth Amendment is important for you if you ever wind up arrested or in court on the witness stand. A portion of this amendment states, "No person shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor to be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." In every crime drama, someone always decides to plead the fifth. They don't want to say anything self-recriminating. In our text today, those who do want Jesus dead, don't really have enough evidence for a guilty verdict until, in response to a direct question, Jesus breaks the silence and speaks the truth. He does not plead the fifth, and the truth he tells incriminates him in the eyes of those who judge him. But our 20th century minds recoil from this. Our democratic ears cringe. Our sense of justice and fairness is offended. Our sympathetic hearts want to change the verdict. For 30 years, my parents worked as counselor parents for adjudicated youth who lived in our home. And often during Lent, my parents would gather the guys to read one of the Gospels the whole way through. And on more than one occasion, when it came to the trial scene and subsequent torture of Jesus, the guys would get really upset. These teenagers understood guilty verdicts. They understood guilt, and they didn't need to be told that Jesus was innocent. It was those witnesses who were the liars. Jesus was telling the truth. He didn't deserve this. Why didn't the truth set him free? For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, and the Son had to die for the world. Before we jump into Mark 14, let's remind ourselves where we are in the story that Mark is telling. Mark rushed so quickly through the first 3 years of Jesus' ministry, but now he has slowed the story way, way down. Chapters 1 through 10 took 3 years, and now chapters 11 to 16 move us through just 7 days, the final week, Holy Week as we now call it. So there was the triumphal entry, and then they've already had the Lord's Supper, and Judas has already betrayed Jesus. And in the last 2 sermons, Derek and Andrew took us to the Garden of Gethsemane as Jesus prayed and then was arrested late in the night. So now it's the late hours of Thursday night into the wee hours of Friday morning before dawn. Mark tells us, "And they led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together. And Peter had followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the guards and warming himself at the fire." So the soldiers that Judas had led to Jesus are now leading Jesus to the high priest, whose name is Caiaphas. Curiously, Caiaphas just happens to be awake, and he just happens to be able to summon all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes at a moment's notice. This is actually the work of Judas' betrayal, right? They've been planning for this night. Passover night, no less, one of the Jews' most sacred holy days set aside for unholy work. I find it interesting, and I believe it's intentional on Mark's part, that we know where Peter is in all of this. Remember, it's likely that Mark wrote this gospel story based on the memories and stories that Peter shared. And so in the chaos of this night, Peter is trying to figure out what to do and how to handle everything. He's been all in with Jesus for years, even though he hasn't understood everything Jesus has said and done. I mean, we know that. He was appalled at Jesus' suggestion that he would have to die. And just minutes ago, Peter chopped off a guard's ear as Jesus was arrested. I mean, that ear could have got him arrested too, except that Jesus miraculously put the ear back on. And now it looks as if Peter is followed at a distance. He's been keeping his eye on Jesus, but he's not running to stand with him. He doesn't go all the way into Caiaphas' house to hear what's being said and possibly speak up on Jesus' behalf. I don't think Peter has a clue what's going on. Maybe he wants to be brave, but he's confused and afraid. And, well, will he fight or flee or just freeze? You'll have to come back next week to find out. Our text today, it focuses on the middle of the night trial before the Jewish council. Mark 14:55 tells us, "Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death. The religious leadership of Israel had it up to here with Jesus. It was one thing when he was up there in Galilee stirring up trouble, but now he's here. He's in Jerusalem. He's in the temple. He's turning over tables. He's healing people in the streets. There's crazy rumors that his friend Lazarus walked out of his tomb. There's rumors he's going to destroy the temple. Jesus is threatening the status quo, and this threat has arrived on their doorstep. And here's what's at stake for them. If Jesus is not stopped, Rome will surely intervene. They don't tolerate would-be kings. All those crazy guys who had claimed to be the Messiah before Jesus, they've been captured and killed. And worse yet, Roman aggression against pretenders to the throne often spills over into the community. And so it's in this tense atmosphere that the high priest and the council, well, they found a way to walk the tightrope as the people of Yahweh under Roman power. And so the Herods rule as kings by Roman decree, and the high priest maintains control of the temple and the rituals established by God. And with the high priest as their head, the ruling body, which is called the Sanhedrin, it's the supreme Jewish religious council and legal body in Jerusalem and Judea. Now, indulge me a moment as I explain this a little further. It's because it's hard for us in a democracy to understand or imagine another form of governance. But we know that Rome is in control, right? And their empire is vast. And while they have an oppressive grip on the region, they allow the Jews some level of self-governance. In the years leading up to Jesus' arrest, the Sanhedrin has actually enjoyed an increase in power. So you've got the high priest plus 70 men from the leading families of priests, Sadducees, and Pharisees. These make up the council. They're the supreme court of justice for the Jewish people, governing every area of their society. However, they're ultimately answerable to the Romans in the region, and they were prohibited from ordering and executing capital punishment. In those cases, they had to work with Rome. And so what all this boils down to is that the highest religious office of the Jewish people was a high priest. And this office, which was instituted by God way back in Exodus, the priests were to be the mediators of God's presence to the people. But at this point in their story, the high priest is maintaining the rituals of the mediator with God. But in the day-to-day reality, he's a mediator between Rome and the people. So imagine you're a member of this council. Your task is to lead the people by your own Jewish laws, while at the same time ensuring that your people don't offend Rome in any way that will lead to soldiers marching into Jerusalem, defiling, desecrating, destroying your temple and your entire way of life. They've done it before, not that long ago. Remember, Rome's policy on pretend kings as Messiah and is death. Rome's policy on keeping peace in its territories is to crush any opposition. The Pax Romana, Roman peace, it's achieved only when those lovely Roman roads facilitate the movement of Roman soldiers to put down Roman opposition. Now, on the other hand, imagine you're not a Jewish elite. You're not a member of the Sanhedrin. You're just an average man or woman. You're weighed down by Roman taxes and Pharisaical laws. And you're hearing rumors that the Messiah has come. The one who could free your family from Roman oppression. The one who will bring true and lasting peace to your people. The promised one, God's king, ushering in a new and better kingdom. You're hopeful that Jesus is all that he claims to be. So this is the tension that's hanging in the air in Jerusalem. And the city is packed full of residents and guests because it's Passover, and the Romans have increased troops due to the influx of population. And the hum of Messiah rumors is in the air. And for the high priest and the Sanhedrin, their biggest priority isn't investigating the truth claims of these rumors. Their priority is to maintain control and power, to protect the temple and the established leadership. This finely balanced state of existence with Rome must not be toppled over, and Jesus is threatening all of that. Like literally toppling over tables in the temple courts, drawing large crowds, performing miraculous signs. Maybe he's threatening to do even more. And he's had his run, but the high priest and company are finally going to put a stop to this. Now, make no mistake, their verdict is decided, but they need the pretext of a trial to both convince their own people and Roman authorities that this guy deserves capital punishment. So they've been seeking people out, asking them about their experiences with Jesus, trying to grasp onto one piece of evidence that will burn this guy. But they found none. What Jesus is doing and saying is driving them crazy, but it isn't enough to condemn him yet. What I want us to learn from this story is that we all have to confront Jesus' claims. What Jesus said and did could not be ignored, not by the high priest and his cronies, not by the Pharisees, not by the average man on the street. What he was saying and doing confronted every man and woman, the whole Jewish people, and he will ultimately confront the whole world with his message. And what happens in a confrontation? What happens when we come up against something or someone that won't back down? Well, we've got to respond. We might not have chosen the confrontation, but we choose our response. I think of epic confrontations like Gandalf in the Mines of Moria. The Fellowship of the Ring is faced with an ancient Balrog. They didn't seek it out, but here it is, and it's blocking their only way forward. Gandalf confronts this overwhelming evil with an unforgettable line, right? "You shall not pass." And an epic battle follows. We're left wondering if Gandalf is still alive. Thankfully, our daily confrontations are not on that scale, but whether we're confronting an unexpected bill, a playground bully, a demotion, a traffic jam, or the hard truth, burying our head in the sand, hoping it will go away is not an option if we want to move forward. So what do? Well, Mark gives us a glimpse of how people are confronting the claims of Jesus. Here in this trial with the Jewish leaders, in the next chapter during his trial before the Roman governor Pilate, during the crucifixion, at his death, Mark opens everyone's eyes and ears to the claims of Jesus. What has been the messianic secret through Mark's gospel, all of those instructions Jesus gave to the people not to tell what he had done and said, well, all of that is being made plain in Jesus' final hours. The identity of Jesus will be revealed. He's a prophet, he's the King of the Jews, he's the Messiah, and he's the Son of God. In our portion of the story today, the Jewish leaders are confronting the claims of Jesus, and there are two possibilities for you to consider. Jesus is a liar, or Jesus is the truth. Lies or truth. Those are your choices when you confront Jesus. There's no soft middle. So let's start with lies. From the high priest's perspective, Jesus must be lying. Surely he can't be the Messiah. He can't be the Son of God, the King of the Jews. Surely not. It'd be really bad for business, after all. But try as they might, the men of the council cannot find corroborating testimony or evidence they need to silence his lies. So what do you do when you're sure someone is wrong and dangerous, but you can't prove it? You do what you have to do, because the ends justify the means. So cue the false witnesses. If we can't get enough evidence from Jesus himself, we'll put a stop to his outrageous claims by issuing some of our own. Mark tells us, now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands.' Yet even about this, their testimony did not agree." Twice, Mark uses the phrase false witnesses. Anytime there's repetition, an author is making a point, and Mark is emphasizing that the charges are trumped up. Even the witness who claims to have heard Jesus say, "I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands." That one's pretty darn close to true. In Mark 13, one of the disciples admired the temple's beauty, remember? And Jesus said, "Do you see these great buildings? There will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." But it's John who records the words that most closely align with this false witness. When Jesus is turning over tables in the temple, the crowd confronts him and asks for a sign of his authority to do such things. And Jesus says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Comparing these statements, the second one most likely to have been overheard, but in neither statement does Jesus say, "I will destroy." In fact, John tells us straight out that Jesus isn't even talking about the building at all, but about his own body. Jesus will be destroyed and raised in 3 days. And spoiler alert, the actual temple itself will be destroyed, not by Jesus, but by the Romans in less than 40 years. Now, the false witnesses are at best twisting Jesus' words. At worst, they're just making stuff up completely. Either way, their testimony doesn't agree. It's the middle of the night. Caiaphas made sure the whole council would be present, and the witnesses are not providing them with a solid case. So he's getting frustrated, and he turns to Jesus. It says, the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But he remained silent and made no answer. Apparently, Jesus was silent through the whole arrest, night march, false witness, the whole ordeal. Peter wasn't in the room, but maybe he could hear from the courtyard, because later Peter would write, "When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats." Peter's words are actually an echo of the servant song in Isaiah 53, which Jesus' followers interpreted as prophecies of the Messiah. Isaiah wrote, "He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth." And this made me wonder why. Why didn't Jesus speak sooner? Why not defend himself? Like Peter or Paul, who would later give speeches to defend Jesus. Why didn't Jesus do it here? A couple thoughts. Isaiah points out in this same prophecy that it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief when his soul makes an offering for guilt. And Peter wrote it this way: "He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed." Peter couldn't stomach the truth that night. If we put ourselves in Peter's shoes, it's hard for us to stomach as well. But Jesus has to die. The path to life is through his death. Without death, there can be no resurrection. The whole story of the Bible has pointed to this. Jesus is the better Passover lamb, dying to deliver his people. Redemption requires payment, and Jesus is about to pay the price to redeem the world. So no, he doesn't speak up to defend himself, even in the face of lies. This is a confrontation that Jesus must lose. His time has come. But I also had another thought as I read this. Jesus has already said with words and deeds all that he needed to say. Caiaphas, all these guys, they'd done their homework. They knew who he was. I think they're so eager to kill him because he's actually walking the walk and talking the talk of the Messiah, and that poses a serious threat to this whole enterprise. It's going to upset the status quo. And when confronted with the idea of surrendering their control and power and way of life to the one who claims, "I am the way and the truth and the life," they're choosing lies over truth. So Jesus stands alone, lied about, accused as a liar. The false witnesses and Jesus' silence do not build a strong enough case against him, though. And that has Caiaphas all worked up. And it leads us to the second possibility when you confront Jesus. You will get the truth. Caiaphas now asks Jesus a direct question, and Jesus' response is an identity claim. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus said, "I am." Now, by the time Jesus says, "I am," here in chapter 14, you and I, the reader, we've already learned that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God. This is acknowledged 3 times in Mark's story by demons, by God himself at Jesus' baptism and transfiguration, and by the disciples when Jesus asked them directly, "Who do you say that I am?" But right here, this is the first time that Jesus openly and publicly acknowledges that, yes, he is the Messiah. And he could have just stopped there with, "I am," but he doesn't. In this confrontation with Caiaphas, Jesus gives him the whole truth, and it's these next words that bring down the guilty verdict because Caiaphas cannot handle the truth. Jesus says, "And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his garments and said, "What further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?" And they all condemned him as deserving death. In a judicial response that's appropriate to their time and culture, Caiaphas tore his clothes. It's interesting, our judges still wear robes, but I cannot imagine one standing up and tearing them when the verdict is read. But what Jesus is saying is outrageous. It's these words, in these words, that Caiaphas finds what he's been looking for all along. Jesus has recriminated himself in front of the whole council. Jesus has delivered to the high priest the very thing he'd been looking for, evidence of blasphemy. No more witnesses are needed. Out of Jesus' own mouth comes the nail in his cross. Now, our job as readers is to ask, how exactly does this one sentence lead to a guilty verdict? Why are these words damning enough for the high priest to march Jesus across town before dawn, to wake up the Roman governor and insist on a death sentence? It's not just the "I am" statement which echoes God's Hebrew name Yahweh. Rather, it's his claim to be the Son of Man coming in God's name to judge the world. To understand that, we have to look at a messianic psalm and an apocalyptic vision. Psalm 110 speaks of the Messiah as the Lord sitting at the right hand of Yahweh. And Daniel describes the following vision. "And behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed." It takes us a little work to bridge the cultural and historical gap to understand what Jesus is saying, but the high priest and the council, they had no problem interpreting his words. In one sentence, Jesus simultaneously claims the identity of the enigmatic figure, the Son of Man, who is given dominion over God's kingdom, with the messianic Lord who is seated at God's right hand. Jesus is implying that he is the Son of God and that one day they will all see him glorified as God. Now, it's true that the Jews were waiting for a Messiah, but they weren't expecting the Messiah to claim to be God. Claiming to be the Messiah was crazy. That's mostly what landed Jesus in this mess. But claiming to be God, that was a wildly bigger deal. This is either true or it is blasphemy. And listen, if this is true and Jesus is the Son of Man who will sit on the right hand of power and come in the clouds of heaven, one must completely rethink what one believes about the Messiah and about power. And right now, the Sanhedrin's fear of power isn't about God so much as it is about Rome. And beneath their fear of Roman power is the fear that they will lose their own power. And so this is why Caiaphas leaps to his feet to pronounce the predetermined verdict. You are guilty, guilty, guilty. And they all condemned him as deserving death. And some began to spit on him and to cover his face and to strike him, saying to him, prophesy. And the guards received him with blows. That's where we end today. We're confronted with this image of Jesus, covered in spit, being mocked and beaten, no one to defend him. He stood before the highest court and they declared him a liar. And today you're confronted by Jesus and you must decide. Is Jesus a liar or is Jesus the truth? There's no neutral middle ground. He is the I am or he's a liar. He deserves condemnation or he's taking the place of those who do. He is who he says he is, or he's a fool with a death wish. I want to challenge all of us today. First, if you've never considered that Jesus is telling the truth, I challenge you to do that. Confront Jesus head on. Don't Google him or read a ChatGPT summary. I challenge you to read Mark's whole story and ask yourself, what if all of this is true? You could do this in your own Bible, or we've got a YouVersion reading plan PDF. You can find it at whoisgrace.com/Mark. And if you're listening and you know that you're the one who was condemned and Jesus took your place, I want to issue you the same challenge, because too often we remake Jesus in our own image and we actually need to be confronted by the truth again. We need to hear as if for the first time, not only that we are forgiven, but that he is the Lord to whom we surrender our will. And so when was the last time you read his story? Pick up Mark's gospel. Let Jesus' words and deeds confront you with the truth. He can't be your Savior and not also be your Lord. Just one more thought. Jesus talked about his upcoming death 3 different times in Mark's story, and in the third one, he predicted this. See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles, and they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. Notice that there are 5 specific predictions: betrayed, condemned, delivered over to the Gentiles, mocked and spit on and flogged and killed. And did Jesus tell the truth? Was he betrayed? Check. Condemned? Check. Delivered over to the Gentiles? That's coming next. Mocked, spit on, flogged? Check, check, check. And spoiler alert, Jesus will die. That's 4 for 5. His 5th prediction will also prove true, for they will destroy his body, but on the 3rd day, on the 3rd day, the Son of Man will rise and he will walk out of the grave. And if Jesus was telling the truth about that, then I boldly propose he told the truth about everything. From his very first words in Mark 1, the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God is at hand. Repent and believe in the gospel. To his declaration of divinity in Mark 14, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. We've been asking ourselves questions for 50 weeks now as we worked through Mark. Jesus, the Son of Man, claims to be the Son of God. So ask yourself, if this is true, how does this picture of Jesus compel me to live differently?